All right, guys, here at Awesemo.com, we have a new partnership with PrizePicks. If you're new to the site, go ahead and make a deposit. Use the promo code Awesemo, and you'll get a $100 match bonus on your first deposit. So definitely go check that out. And also, if you want to see more of the information, it's right above me on the screen right now. So that is easy enough to figure out. Also, if you're not familiar with the fantasy scoring, it goes on at PrizePicks. It is the exact same as what we have at FanDuel. So if you want to use the projections that we have at Awesemo.com, go to our FanDuel section. You'll be able to look at the same projections that we would have for some of these players over at PrizePicks, but it's 3 points for defensive stats, so 3 points for a block and a steal, -1 points for a turnover, 1 point for every point that players score, 1.2 points for rebound, then 1.5 points for each assist. So those are the numbers that I'm going to be using when I'm building out projections and trying to figure out how many points that I expect each player to score using the prize point scoring system. All right, so now I'm counting down my top 5 prize pick plays for tonight. This is based on some of the data we have for prize picks and just overall the fantasy point output, whether I expect these guys to go over or under their posted numbers. So starting at number 5, Aaron Gordon under 25 fantasy points for tonight. So Aaron Gordon was a big acquisition by the Denver Nuggets at the trade deadline, and ultimately it looked like he was going to play a pretty big role for the team, but it's never really come to fruition. And even though Denver's dealing with a lot of injuries, Jamal Murray's out, Will Barton is out, PJ Dozier's out, we've never really seen Aaron Gordon's role really uptick in a meaningful way. So far in this series, he's playing 28 minutes per game, which, it's a little more than what he's played overall with his time in Denver, except he's had very few big fantasy performances. So over the last 2 months, during his time with Denver, he's only averaging 22.07 prize pick fantasy points. So to me, that 25 number, that's one to be underneath. Pick number 4, some of that I'm looking at is Chris Paul over 31 fantasy points. Now, I'm taking a little bit of a leap of faith here because obviously Chris Paul, he has the shoulder issue that caused him to play very poorly in game 1. Then game 2, he was unable to finish, and Campaign ultimately ended up closing the game out for the Phoenix Suns, what was ultimately a loss for them in game 2 against the Lakers, and the Lakers were able to even the series. But my gut feeling for today, as of right now, is that Chris Paul is going to play. He's listed as probable, and I have him playing close to his normal minutes. I think there's maybe a little bit of risk here that he might be limited, but I think if we do assume that he plays close to his normal role, this is a really low number for Chris Paul, who, if we look at him down the stretch of the season when the Suns are really fighting for a playoff spot, he's been healthy really for the entire season, other than this unfortunate stretch of playoff luck, which we've seen from Chris Paul in the past. But for the season, 37.49 prize pick fantasy points, that's what he averaged. And as long as he is somewhat healthy, I expect him to go over that number. And the other thing to consider, too, with this number being set so low at 31, is even if we get 80% of Chris Paul, if you take 80% of his fantasy points for the year, you're still getting right around that number. So just on the chance that I think that he should be healthier now going forward, that he's had a few days since he suffered that shoulder injury, I like the over on Chris Paul, and there's a chance that he actually goes over that number by a pretty big margin. So at number 3, I'm going with the under on Campaign's fantasy modes. Now, by the way, if I'm wrong on the health of Chris Paul, I'm probably going to be wrong on both props for Chris Paul and for Campaign, because Campaign, in the last game, he played really well, but overall for the season, obviously he's been behind Chris Paul on the depth chart, and we just saw him really have to step up last game because of the injury to Paul. So last game, Campaign ended up playing 33 minutes. He scored 40 prize pick points. But if you look at game 1 of the series, which, by the way, Campaign did get ejected, except it's not like he was on pace to play a massive amount of minutes. But in that game, he ended up playing 13 minutes, scored 9 prize pick points. And for the season, Campaign, he played 18 minutes per game. He averaged 18.5 prize pick points per game. And if we look at this number, it seems to be assuming that there's some sort of injury situation going on with Chris Paul. And while that is the case, I still think that we're going to see a healthier version of Chris Paul today. So I think we're going to see Campaign play a diminished role. I don't think he's going to be closing the game out for the Suns. I think it's ultimately going to be Chris Paul running the point in the fourth quarter. So with that in mind, I think we see Campaign a little bit closer to what his regular season role was, and probably closer to the 20 fantasy point total than that 24 number. For pick number 2, I'm looking at Giannis Antetokounmpo to go over 58 fantasy points. So we've seen a pretty big change in philosophy from the Milwaukee Bucks and coach Mike Budenholzer and how he's approached his playoff rotations. Last year, he had said during the playoffs when he was questioned about why he wasn't playing his starters more minutes, he had said that he felt that if he had to play his star players 40 minutes in a playoff game, that he didn't even think they deserved to win. He didn't think that was something he should have to do in the playoffs, but ultimately the Bucks last year ended up getting bounced by the Heat in the playoffs. That same matchup against the Heat this year, and Mike Budenholzer is not taking any of the same liberties with the playing time for his starters. In the first game of the series, a competitive game, it did end up going to overtime. Giannis played 45.5 minutes. So that was over 40 minutes in regulation. Then game 2, he ended up playing 31 minutes, but only because it was a blowout. Once again, Giannis is on pace to play somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 minutes. Had that game been more competitive. So we look at Giannis, who's one of the best overall fantasy producers in the league for the season. He played 33 minutes per game and averaged 54.1 prize pick points. If we're now going to say that Giannis approaches 40 minutes, then for me personally, I'm looking at Giannis scoring over 60 prize pick fantasy points. So with this increased minutes load that we're seeing Giannis playing, as long as this game stays close, I think there's a pretty good chance that we see Giannis score more fantasy points than any other player on today's slate. Pick number 1, the player who I like the most tonight for prize pick is going to be Jimmy Butler. The Miami Heat are in a little bit of a hole right now. Dropped the first 2 games of the series to the Milwaukee Bucks. And so now we're in a situation where the Heat really need to start winning games. And as a result, I think we're going to see Jimmy Butler play a massive amount of minutes today. I think over 40 minutes is not out of the question for Jimmy Butler. This is something we saw him do in the NBA Finals last year, and kind of a similar situation, must-win spot for the Miami Heat. Jimmy Butler, I think, is going to see a big uptick in minutes, and also, I mean, what we've seen from him so far this series, he's really struggled to shoot the ball. He only has 17.7% usage rating in game 2. And I'm playing a little bit into a narrative here, but given the overall situation that the Heat are in, I, number 1, think that Jimmy Butler is going to play more minutes than we normally see. And then number 2, I think Jimmy Butler is going to take it upon himself to really try to carry the team. I think there's a chance we see an uptick in his usage rate today. So with that in mind, give me over 46 fantasy points for Jimmy Butler to try to get the Heat back in this series against the Bucks. So just to recap my top overall plays today on PrizePicks. Number 5, Aaron Gordon, under 25 fantasy points. Number 4, Chris Paul, over 31 fantasy points. Campaign, under 24 fantasy points. So a little bit of correlation there. If I like Chris Paul to be healthy today, I'm expecting more minutes to go to him, a little less to go to Campaign. So that's why the over for Chris Paul and the under for Campaign. And number 2, Giannis Antetokounmpo to go over 58 fantasy points. And then Jimmy Butler to go over 46 fantasy points. So hoping for a little bit of a shootout there between the Milwaukee Bucks and the Miami Heat. And those are all my favorite picks for today. But also, guys, don't forget, if you're new to PrizePicks, go sign up, use the promo code Awesemo, and make your first deposit to get up to a $100 deposit match bonus.